And I am a program manager here with our Unchained California team. I'm so excited that you guys are able to join us today. We have a really great presentation, and I'm really excited to hear our great presenters today. So before we get started, as everybody starts trickling in, if you want to drop your name and your organization in the chat, we'd love to see some of the names of the people that are here today. I don't know about where everybody else is, but I'm currently in Riverside and it is very hot today. So if I start to talk too loud or start to lose my train of thought, we'll just blame it on the heat today because it's like 90 degrees already. So now that people are starting to trickle in, we'll do a really quick overview of where the campaign is. As you guys may know, we officially launched back in March 2023, and we'll be working on our first year of the campaign through January. So it is a 10-month span. And we so far have been really excited. We've shared some stories. Hopefully all of you are following us on Facebook and Instagram. We have some great content that we've been putting out. We've activated 50 partners. So we are halfway through our goal for our first year. If you're not a partner yet, shoot us an email. We can talk about what that means. We've collected 16 stories and we have a bunch more that are coming your way. And we have over 270 newsletter signups. So again, if you're not registered, if you're not signed up for the newsletter, you can do so on our homepage of the website, unshamedca.org. And if you know anyone who wants to share a story, maybe you want to share a story, maybe you have someone in mind that you think might be interested, shoot us an email and we can talk about what the process is, what it means, all of the timelines and everything. We can talk about that. And then lastly, plug for the next webinar as well. Our next webinar will be on August 17th. You can go to tinyurl.com/unshamedca webinar. The third Thursday of every month. You can sign up for all of them if you want, and then I'll send you a reminder once it gets closer to the date. Add them to your calendars. Lastly, housekeeping. We will have the Q&A on throughout, as well as the chat. So if you have any questions as Asha and Lauren are presenting, feel free to drop it in there. We'll be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A. You can also turn on interpretation. So if you need, you'd prefer to listen in Spanish, that interpretation button, and our interpreters will be doing that. For any other questions, feel free to email me, alfaro@shatterproof.org. And with that, I'm really excited to be introducing two amazing women today. First, we have Lauren Lawson-Zilai. She's the Senior Director, Media and Public Relations for Shatterproof. In her role, she leads the organization's thought leadership, drives national awareness, and manages all facets of the communication across print, digital, social, podcasts, and broadcasts. Lauren has been named the Reagan Communications and PR Daily Top Women in Communication, PR News Top PR Women of the Year, and PR News PR Professional of the Year. We could probably go on for an hour with all of the different accolades that Lauren has, but we're really excited to have her today. And we also have Asha Carroll, who's our Senior Director for the National Stigma Initiative here at Shatterproof. She oversees the Stigma digital team and the execution of evidence-based, community-centered marketing, messaging, and media strategies to reduce addiction stigma. In her past, Asha's been a communications director and spokesperson for a major state political party. She is also worked on races for city council and Congress. And she's also an SBA award-winning 3-time CPG startup founder and brings 10 years of experience in digital and partnership marketing, where she grew her career matchmaking consumer brands with celebrities and influencers back in the early days of Instagram. So we are really excited to have both of them. With that, I will pass it over to Asha. And let me bring up your slide here.
Thank you so much, Leslie, and we are so happy to be here today. Our webinar today has 3 objectives. Number one, participants will learn how language influences addiction stigma, plus recommended terminology and messaging for increasing awareness and education. Two, today's participants will examine the impact of issue framing on public health outcomes.
And three, participants will get the tools to talk about substance use disorders, SUDs, in a media setting, including the art of the pivot and bridging and blocking.
7 of the 9 key drivers of the overdose epidemic are driven by pervasive stigma. These include shame and social isolation, individuals not seeking help for their addiction, and more specifically, barriers to seeking health, insufficient treatment capacity, healthcare coverage and reimbursement disparities, non-evidence-based treatment, criminalization of people with substance use disorders or SUDs, and social and structural barriers to recovery. Stigma is a mark of disgrace that is associated with a particular circumstance, a quality, or a person. At Shatterproof, we are focused on addiction stigma or negative attitudes and beliefs about people with substance use disorder. Stigma is a barrier to receiving healthcare and to engaging in help-seeking behaviors, and it results in discrimination and exclusion for people with SUD. Public stigma, or the stigma held by a group toward individuals with SUD, is a driver for other types of stigma, like self-stigma, the negative attitudes we hold about ourselves, structural stigma, systems-level stigma that can impact policy outcomes, such as carceral or healthcare outcomes, and stigma toward MOUD, or medications for opioid use disorder, like buprenorphine or methadone. Stigma plays a significant role in creating what is a devastating public health crisis. It prevents many people with substance use disorder from seeking treatment. Stigma limits the ability of institutions and providers to offer help when someone seeks assistance by limiting their resources or perpetuating policies that can be harmful to those with SUD. Stigma also can fuel a feeling of shame that serves as an obstacle to long-term health for people with SUD, whether or not those individuals have received treatment. It carries significant health consequences for individuals and for the public health of our communities. And addiction stigma is here in California. Our 2023 statewide survey found that only 21.9% of Californians are aware that a person with opioid use disorder or OUD are experiencing a chronic medical illness. Only 42% of Californians would be willing to move next door to a person with OUD, and only 39% of Californians would be willing to have a person with OUD as a close personal friend. Now, over 80% of Californians view a person with OUD who is engaging in active substance use as unpredictable. And still, over 60% of Californians view a person with OUD who is in recovery today as unpredictable. Stigma is influenced by a variety of factors, which include blame, stereotypes, knowledge about SUD, contact and experiences, race, ethnicity, and culture, and media portrayals. Public perceptions are strongly influenced by social norms that concern the attribution of cause or blame for substance use disorders. And a lack of causal knowledge about SUD as a medical condition can also influence negative attitudes towards structural supports for people with SUD. Back to those factors, stereotypes can fuel other types of stigma, such as a person's willingness to interact with a person with SUD. People are less likely to endorse stereotypes if they've had contact with a person with SUD and say they haven't experienced this stereotyped behavior. So that's promising. Public knowledge of SUD is still limited, and so is knowledge among professions who may interface with people with SUD, such as healthcare practitioners who work outside of the behavioral health field. Knowledge about mental health and substance use disorders can positively influence public norms. And so we know that increasing that knowledge is critical to reducing stigma. In regards to contact and experience, evidence suggests that more contact with people with substance use disorders is associated with lower levels of addiction stigma. And race, ethnicity, and culture are an inextricable part of social relationships, and those contribute to shaping our attitudes, our beliefs, and our behaviors. The quality of care that people receive can be compromised by barriers such as language and providers' misunderstanding of cultural ideas about health, illness, or treatment modalities. The media that we consume, that can provide depictions of behavioral health that can influence public attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that the general public experiences toward people with SUD. Throughout and encompassing these factors, our communities influence how we think about addiction, and so too can contribute to driving stigma. Our communities may use contrasting language that suggests that people in recovery are clean, implying that people in active substance use are perceived as dirty or shameful. Not in my backyard or NIMBY framing can fuel an us versus them narrative that may increase isolation or have a negative impact on people's access to care. And narratives that portray negative stereotypes of people with SUD can drive prejudice and discrimination that are related to negative health outcomes. But working together and amplified by the media, our communities can play a powerful role in stigma reduction. Through person-first language, we can build mutual respect within our communities and remove negative connotations that are associated with labeling those with SUD. We can frame addiction through a lens of hope and healing, and educate the public on external factors and barriers to healthcare that people with SUD face. And we can also decrease proximity to people with SUD by sharing personal stories throughout our communities. We can start with language. The words we use matter. Stigmatizing language assigns negative labels, stereotypes, or judgment to people with SUD. And it can drive any of those 4 types of stigma: self-stigma, public stigma, structural stigma, or stigma toward medications for opioid use disorder, or MOUD. We know that words like addict or substance abuse are associated with more stigmatized views, but use of these terms is still prevalent in our communities and in stories about addiction. One study found that 49% of news stories about the opioid epidemic mentioned at least one stigmatizing term. Less than 5% of those stories mentioned expanding treatment options for SUD. Even fewer of those mentioned expanding access to medication as treatment, like MOUD. So we see that there's great room for improvement. One immediate action that we can take is to use person-first language. Person-first language is a way to emphasize the person and view their medical condition as just one part of a whole person. Person-first language is neutral in tone, and it can make the difference between destroying or uplifting a person through words. It removes the language that has negative connotations on a societal level. And we use phrases like person with a substance use disorder or person in recovery. That's person first language. People exposed to this language are less likely to say that a person with SUD is personally responsible for their medical condition. They're also less likely to recommend punitive rather than therapeutic action for people with SUD. For example, those who've been involved with nonviolent drug-related crimes. It's so important to note that language and identity are deeply personal. So when we educate and encourage the use of non-stigmatizing language, we're establishing best practices for the general public. People with SUD may choose to identify with whatever language feels right to them. And that's not for us to influence or to define as members of the general public. With that in mind, the evidence base informs the following suggestions for language best practices when speaking about substance use disorders. Substance use disorder, or opioid use disorder, or alcohol use disorder, and so forth, or addiction, is neutral language that can increase the understanding of SUD as a medical condition. It carries fewer implications of blame than terms such as abuse, habit, or problem. When we put people first, we reduce discrimination. So we say person with a substance use disorder or person with addiction, instead of terms associated with judgment like addict or user. Recurrence can be a normal part of a person's journey. It's not a break or an error in their recovery. We can use this language instead of relapse or slip. We can also use person-first language to talk about recovery, celebrating and centering a person's growth rather than focusing solely on their past experiences. This guidance is based on the Shatterproof Addiction Language Guide and on Shatterproof's white paper, A Movement to End Addiction Stigma, and it's supported by guidance from the APA and NIDA. Framing theory suggests that the way a concept is packaged and presented influences audiences' attitudes and beliefs. How are the stories that we tell, how are those presenting the topic of substance use disorder? How is our framing influencing the way that our communities think about addiction? The content that we consume, it affects what we think about, what we worry about, what we want to shop for or have for dinner. An agenda setting, whether by mass media or community-based communications from healthcare, law enforcement, or other public information sources, can influence the public's perceived priorities, and it can fuel frames counter to the evidence base. Framing can weaken some voices while strengthening others. And framing can invite the possibility of more complex emotional responses, whether positive, negative, or a combination of the two. So we can frame stories by collecting key themes or ideas that are the focus of the message. And we can incorporate storytelling or narrative techniques to help support those themes. A couple examples of story framing include causal accounts, meaning according to this account, we explain an event by pointing to the chain of causes that led up to it. Narrative perspectives, meaning the point of view from which a story is told. And the casting of actors into character roles like heroes and villains. For example, a person with SUD, a loved one of a person with SUD, or a person interacting with a person with SUD, like a medical provider or law enforcement professional, could be portrayed as a hero or a villain in a story. We can tell stories to influence stigma reduction by implementing contact-based strategies. Communities and media organizations can collaborate in the development of stories and educational content that center people with SUD to decrease proximity, and they can consult experts to connect audiences to resources and counter misinformation that is being distributed by other outlets and throughout our communities. We can use themes of hope and themes of healing, and we can educate on barriers to treatment faced by people with SUD. Our ideal messengers, those are people with lived experience, and they're subject matter experts, not just bystanders who may bring their own stigmatizing perspectives to the story. And our methods can include warm calls to action, sticky or memorable language, non-stigmatizing visual elements like those that depict connection instead of criminalization. And our methods can communicate accurate, evidence-based information instead of sensationalized stories that are designed to elicit an emotional response or to solely attract attention and clicks. The evidence base informs the following suggestions for framing best practices when speaking about substance use disorders. When we frame SUD as treatable and manageable, we can reduce stigma. Messaging addressing the effectiveness of treatments and outlining barriers to access can increase support for policies designed to overcome these barriers, instead of framing SUD as a character flaw or a moral failure or something that is curable or incurable. Instead, we can share stories that address both treatment and recovery and depict that full picture. There are biological, psychological, and social factors related to SUD. So messaging that emphasizes societal causes and factors outside the control of the individual makes audiences more likely to support societal solutions. So we can use that framing that centers on causation and align to the evidence base, instead of misinformation that suggests that addiction is biological only, is personal responsibility and blame related, is a weakness or a choice, or is related to individual causes and solutions only. SUD can affect anyone and everyone. Stories that share perspectives from loved ones, like from parents speaking about their child with SUD, can increase sympathy from the general public. We can also match the demographics of our story sharers with those in our target audiences as to avoid additional stigma that audiences may have toward individuals with other stigmatized characteristics, such as sex, race and ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. When we communicate that SUD can affect anyone, we are able to counter framing that communicates a not in my backyard or a NIMBY sentiment or exceptionalism, right? SUD only affects these people, as well as individualism. And finally, when we frame SUD as something that doesn't or shouldn't define a person, and we use sympathetic narratives, communicate and depict people with SUD's participation in meaningful life activities, and focus on solutions, we can overcome communications or sentiments of hopelessness that contribute to stigma, instead of framing SUD as something that is a struggle or that is associated with suffering. We can humanize individuals to reduce stigma. And we can also center on its treatability.
Thanks, Asha. I wanted to talk about media and start off with this quote because it is from a former journalist, And his recommendations as media have standards in place for reporting on war, terrorism, suicide, and people with disabilities, but not always people who use substances and people with SUDs. I won't read the whole quote, but emphasize these words. He says, "Words matter. Images are powerful. We can feed stigma and reinforce stereotypes. We can blame the ill, or we can empower them to get well." And that's where the media comes in. Media influences how we think about addiction. When it comes to people with SUDs and people who use or have used substances, accurate reporting that doesn't use stigmatizing words or images will contribute to a healthier society. That means that reporters have to understand that an SUD is not a moral failing and that it is a treatable chronic health condition. Better reporting will mean better impact. Journalism that recognizes that SUDs are treatable conditions will inspire conversations that will inform public perception, health policies, and investment. There are ways that you can do this as spokespeople, as subject matter experts, and as comms professionals. Number one, frame the story as a health issue. This will lead to greater compassion, public understanding, and improved public policy. Number two, use balanced images. Don't use images and videos that reinforce stereotypes. It's a poor misrepresentation of people who use substances. Balanced images are important because substance use affects people across all social strata. Number three, choose your story and subject carefully. Journalists need to figure out what their story is about. Is it about substance use among the homeless? Is it about people using substances more during the pandemic? Is it about youth and substances? Regardless, these demographics are suffering and you shouldn't add to their pain. It's also important to have both a professional to talk about SUD in addition to a person with lived experience. So you have the human interest aspect. It takes time, but it's essential for accurate reporting. And number four, stick to the facts. Journalists can often break the cycle by telling the story of someone rather than labeling them and prioritize their dignity and equality above all else. For example, Alex has been drinking since he was 16. He's now 21 and hopes for X. Before you speak or do an interview or a speaking presentation, it's important to define your audience to tailor your words accurately. Not every interview will be with media, but every public speaking presence has the opportunity to make an impact. Any interview or speaking opportunity, whether with a donor, legislator, partner, etc., offers you the chance to make positive points, provide education, or provide helpful information about your topic or your organization. Here are some tips to manage your speaking opportunities. Develop key messages with strong facts and examples. Anticipate questions. People often say, "I don't know what they're going to ask me." But if you pause and think about it, you do know the questions they'll likely ask you. Based on your messages, create positive responses. Recognize that many tough questions often fall into topics or themes. Organize them under issue buckets, and no matter what challenging question is poised, you can transition to your messages. Here's the point. Reporters will always have their own angle or agenda for a story, and so will you. You need to give them the positive messages to support your story. For delivering key messages, a key media message is a short nugget of information that supports your overall media interview and your business objectives. Each one should be a positive, memorable statement you want to address, whether the interviewer asks you about it or not. You should take time to really think about your business and organization, what it does, and the subject of addiction. What do you want people to know? How do you want them to respond to that information? Distill it down to 3 points that you think are the most important and write them down. Then think about proof points you can use. Maybe it's a statistic or legislation or a recommendation. Keep them simple and decide which of your key messages each proof point works best with. Simplify the top 3 key messages you wish to convey. Practice repeating them so they flow naturally rather than like you memorize them. Aim to repeat your 3 messages 3 times during the interview so that one will sink in. It's the rule of 3 times 3. And try to keep your messages short and pithy, 30 to 60 seconds. Once you have those, you can then adapt each message to different audiences and situations for clients, for speeches, funders, etc. Make sure you have good notes of your key messages so you'll be prepared for anything. I'm sure you all know that dealing with the media can be very positive as it creates impact for your research, helps develop credibility among your peers and external stakeholders, and can provide you with secondary marketing tools to use in promoting your work and fundraising. But there are things you must accept in dealing with the media. You can't control what the reporters report. The story will be much simpler than you think. Usually the reporter will be on deadline, on a very tight deadline, and dealing with a reporter or news crew is going to take time. There are rules for dealing with the media. Rule 1, you don't have to answer every question a reporter asks. Rule 2, most reporters don't expect you to answer every question. They already know your answer. Think of certain questions as fishing expeditions. They dangle the question as bait to see if you'll bite. And rule 3, you should be credible when you decline to answer a reporter's question or bridge to your responses. Reporters don't mind a non-answer, and a bridge, particularly if you give a reason for the non-answer. So what is a bridge? The most common mistake committed in interviews is to become so fixated by the questions that you lose sight of your own agenda points and become a passive respondent. You will often be asked questions that don't get to the points you wish to make or that you don't wish to answer. You can use bridging to turn the question to your points. Listen for the larger issue behind the question and find that connection to your issue. Bridging also means taking the discussion from an unfriendly to friendly territory by making a smooth transition from an undesirable question or topic to an area that fits your agenda. These are some example bridge phrases to steer the conversation. I am inspired by. It's important to understand. What's most interesting about X is, and let me provide some context. And lots of additional examples here, especially in relation to what's relevant or important and how to make a bigger point. My favorites, let me put that into perspective for you. I think what you're really asking me is X, or what you need to understand is the following. Sometimes there are negative or forced choice questions, but there are ways around that. Regardless of the questions you are asked, state your answers in a positive way. If a question starts with a negative assertion, find a way to rephrase it so that your answer is neither affirmative nor defensive. Never repeat wrong information, even if offered by the reporter. If you do, you will often be quoted that way. So offer a correction framed not as a denial, but as a statement about the facts you want to represent. Avoid either or questions. You don't have to get locked into an answer. Always deliver your key message regardless of the question. And before answering a question, pause, consider your selling point on that issue, create a bridge, and address the audience. speaking of the power of the pause, it's okay to take a beat between answering questions and thinking about what you want to say, especially if it's an important point or something new that hasn't been discussed yet. Reporters will often use our natural discomfort with silence to see if they can lead us into filling the silence with the one thing you hope you don't want to say out loud. What you need to do is use single clear sentences to make your point. Don't continue talking after you made your point, and just smile and wait for the next question. Another useful technique besides bridging is something called blocking. Blocking needs to avoid an unwelcomed or unproductive question by a reporter. It may be a hostile or controversial question, an undesirable hypothetical situation or choice, a request for information that is confidential and that you cannot disclose, or simply something that doesn't pertain to your agenda during a brief interview. If something is beyond your subject matter expertise, you can say that or refer the reporter to another individual. Otherwise, these are some techniques that you can use. A equals Q plus 1. This is a simple and effective way to have every question become an opportunity to make your point and to answer a question with a very brief answer and then one of your key messages. This allows you to repeat a few key messages. So the example is short answer to question, which supports our overall arching goal of blank. There's also flagging or headlining. So when you're trying to make your key messages clear quickly in an interview, you start with the conclusions and end with the explanations. You flag or headline the issue. So think of it like a newspaper. You can simply make your point and then explain it, or you can draw attention by saying phrases such as, this is significant because the most important issue fact is, what we really want to make clear is that, or this is exciting because. And finally, enumerating points. When you have a complex message, you can carefully extend the soundbite by enumerating your points, making it difficult for the media outlet to separate them. For example, the 3 reasons sharing stories is important are, or there are 3 things every person should know about addiction. And finally, keep calm and prepare in advance. If you don't have or know the information, don't pretend you do. Offer to get back to the reporter. Never say something you don't want to appear in print or be aired. And if you make an error, it's okay. Correct yourself as soon as possible. To recap, there are do's and don'ts for conducting an interview. Do be succinct and to the point. Do tell the truth without divulging confidential information. Do speak in human terms. Avoid jargon or acronyms. Do be quotable. Keep your answers short and simple. Do listen to the entire question before responding. Seek clarification if you need it. Do state the answer positively and constructively, regardless of the tone of the question. Do be prepared to follow your initial answer with specific support for your position, such as examples, facts, or stats. Do use anecdotes if appropriate to illustrate the points. After the interview, do invite the reporter to call back to check facts and stats. And there are a few don'ts. Don't speculate or allow yourself to be drawn outside of your area of expertise or respond to secondhand information. Don't respond to inappropriately hypothetical questions. Don't say no comment without providing a brief explanation that is accurate and plausible about why you will not or cannot comment. Don't say, that's a really good question. Reporters actually hate that. Don't introduce negatives to the interview. Don't repeat an objectionable question. Don't allow body language or poor eye contact to give you the appearance of discomfort or evasion. And don't make a statement if you don't want it quoted. Assume there is no such thing as off the record. I really appreciate your time. I've put together a number of resources that are across the US and Canada and classify them by guides, infographics, fact sheets, videos, etc. We will share this out, but the one resource I really wanted to highlight, if you're not familiar, is the first one, which is Changing the Narrative. And it's a network of reporters, researchers, academics, and advocates concerned about the way media represents substance use and addiction. And their mission is to help journalists and opinion leaders provide accurate, humane, and scientifically grounded information. So it's a really good one to check out. Again, we thank you so much for your time. We will take questions, and then we also have our contact information at the end if you want to reach out directly.
I should know how to unmute. Thank you so much for that information, Asha and Lauren. It was fantastic. If anybody does have questions, I encourage you to add them to the chat or the Q&A. I know there were a couple of questions around if we will be providing these slides. Yes, I'll make sure they go in the follow-up email that'll go out in the next couple of days. So you'll be able to see all of these do's and don'ts, the resources, everything that goes along with that. So feel free to drop in those questions. My first question can be to either of you. A lot of this information is super useful, yes, for doing media interviews, but what are some other ways that we can apply some of these tips and tricks into our everyday lives, especially for those of us that might not be speaking to reporters, but are speaking to donors or general audience members?
I can kick that off. So in a previous role, I did elevator pitch training for staff. And my point was, you're always a message deliverer, whether you're at your child's soccer game, your grocery shopping, your wherever in the public sphere, a conference, a networking event. And there's always an opportunity to talk about what you do, why you do it, and your organization. We can certainly share those out. I have some great resources about elevator pitches, but my point is that even if you are not officially media trained or a member of your PR team, you're still a spokesperson, and what you do is so credible. So you should always have your 3 key messages at the ready, and you never know who you might interact with or run into. It might be a potential funder. It might be someone who can participate in a fundraising walk for your organization to raise money for addiction. It might be someone that can provide some resources. So it's always essential to have that messaging handy.
I would add to what Lauren said, in that language and framing are a part of every conversation, whether you are representing yourself in a professional capacity or whether you're having a conversation at the dinner table. So I do think that educating ourselves and our networks on these practices by demonstrating these techniques is a great way to educate in real time and in a way that's organic and a part of our daily lives.
Great. I believe we can also get those pitch ideas out on the email. So I'll follow up with Lauren and make sure you get them as well, Jillian. I think one of the main questions is we still continue to see so much of this language, especially in like news articles or like, just news stories that we're watching on TV. Is there anything that we as like community members can do to get the word out about how we frame or how we talk about substance use disorder?
I'll start there. I'd say share your story. If the media is portraying stories about substance use disorder, why not you sharing that story? If you have lived experience, or if in your work you are that expert, or you interface with the topic of substance use disorder, and you have this education and you have these intentions that you want to reduce stigma, you can be that person. The more that we share stories that reinforce these anti-stigma narratives, the more we can counter those more stigmatizing stories. So I'll say, why not you? And over to you, Lauren, if you've got more to share.
Sure. I will say from a PR perspective, if there are any comms folks on the line, you don't have to have a story to pitch. Anytime I see language used by a reporter, I'll often reach out to them just to educate them, to say, this is our organization, and I saw your use of X. I would just consider you, or consider that you consider this framing when telling the story. I think that's the biggest issue, is just reporters are so strapped with time and they don't have the education that they need at their fingertips. So they do need that. They need personal stories. From a community relations perspective or grassroots, in your communities, there's Rotary clubs, better business bureaus, and I think there are opportunities there to offer yourself up as a speaker and to share that content on social or with local media, because that's another form of communication. And we all know that so many people are impacted, either personally or have friends or family members. So the content will be very relevant to them.
Great. We have a question here from the audience. What strategies can professionals and organizations implement to integrate person-centered language?
I'll start. You can use the guide and the resources that we shared today. I can't stress enough, these are publicly available resources, and they're here for you to share with your organizations immediately. So I would start there. And I would also recommend that you do pursue training for your organization or for the folks that you interface with. Again, there are experts who are willing to speak on this, or you can work to become that expert for your community. So I would say continue to educate yourself. We've included sources and studies in the deck so that you can see where these recommendations are coming from and the evidence base. And I also think that you can start simply. As Lauren mentioned, it's never too late to identify where these stigmatizing words are in use and to work to replace those in your communications. You can also be proactive. And when your organization is copy editing, or there's got to be that review phase for any of your communications, that's a simple step that you can take. And so if you see a word like abuse or addict come up, it's a prime opportunity to replace it with person first language.
Anything to add around that, Lauren?
My background is actually, it started with Goodwill, which focuses on people with disabilities and helping people find work. And so I was there previously to Shatterproof, and we had a person first language guide, and that's really hit home for me. So like Asha said, anytime you're writing or speaking, be conscious of person with a disability or person with low income. And it's really about helping that person find dignity and purpose and well-being and contribute to their mental health so that they're not being labeled or defined, because there's much more to them than, say, a substance use disorder or mental health disorder. And that's what we need to keep in mind. This can apply to employers, to organizations. It's a real educational opportunity.
We had a question earlier that you answered, Asha, but I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about the survey, the SASE that we use, and those statistics that you shared. Can you tell us a little bit about how it's implemented, where we're getting the information from, and how we use it?
Absolutely. Thanks, Leslie. And I'll go ahead, if you don't mind, I'll restate that question and work through my response to it. So a question said, the comment about 60% of people would find a person in recovery from OUD is unpredictable. Regarding that comment, how many years in recovery would affect that relationship? Or if you have long-term sobriety, would that figure, that 60% change? So what I responded here is that our survey, which was conducted in early 2023, used a vignette strategy. So in that survey, we delivered 2 vignettes to survey respondents. One vignette told a story of a person who is currently using substances. So that person is in active use. That's the 80% figure that I shared. 80% of respondents said that they would view that person as unpredictable. That's traditional prejudice measured right there in our survey. Now, 60%, the number here in the question, of respondents said that they would view a person in recovery as unpredictable. And the vignette that we used to measure that recovery told a story of a person who had not used substances in over 1 year. So to answer the initial question, we did not distribute multiple recovery vignettes, and therefore we did not compare responses to vignettes that portrayed shorter term or longer term recovery in our survey. So when I say in recovery, we shared a story of a person who had not used substances in over 1 year. I think it would be very interesting to measure for those durations, and perhaps that's something that we could measure at a later time. Leslie, if you have any other questions, or if attendees here have questions about the survey, I'd be happy to answer those. This was a statewide survey in California.
We do have a question here about just some general questions about, using the word use versus abuse. Some of the people that are using substances might not necessarily have a substance use disorder. So how do we differentiate between the two? How do we talk about them in a way that isn't stigmatizing, but are still able to differentiate between?
So when speaking about where we conventionally saw the word abuse, we could use the word use, or we could use the word misuse. Both of those would be appropriate, and it sounds to me like for your question, misuse might be my recommended term. Lauren.
Yes, I know that abuse is often associated or has a high association with negative judgments and punishment. So agree with Asha's recommendations. And then what we encourage, if someone is speaking about themselves, they're going to use language that's comfortable for them. And we never want to change that or alter that. But in general speaking, or in press materials, giving presentations, I would encourage to use the words that Asha recommended. You're muted, Leslie.
Again, I do this all the time. What messaging should concentration on to decrease stigma among health providers and prescribers? So, should we be talking to medical professionals differently when we're trying to convey these messages and convey the importance of non-stigmatizing language?
One thing that I touched on in my portion of the presentation was that there is a stigma, in particular associated with those healthcare providers who are not specifically behavioral health providers. So our research does show that there is a need to further educate health providers, or in this case, prescribers, as you say. I think there's a lot that we can share in both education on substance use disorder as a medical condition, in substance use disorders treatability. Lauren also touched on the role of substance use disorder as a chronic illness. But I think there's also a lot of education that we can do on the medication side. So as you say, prescribers. So as this campaign has a specific focus on opioid use disorder, there is education on medication for opioid use disorder that we want to communicate to the healthcare community. That is that MOUD, or medication for opioid use disorder. You may also be familiar with the term MAT. It is an effective treatment for opioid use disorder. And also, we know that clinics that provide MOUD in our communities help our communities recover. We know that here, like in California, there is stigma within the general public on these topics. And other research tells us that there is stigma on these topics within the healthcare community as well. So I would start there, but I would also argue that social distance and prejudice, these things that we address on the general public or the population level, would also still be useful messages to share with those healthcare providers. And I'm saying that based off of our survey, which is a representative sample of the general public, the California population, not of the healthcare community. But I'm taking that information and then I'm also making recommendations based on that secondary research that's available to us.
We do also record all of our past webinars, and one of our first webinars was on the power of non-stigmatizing language. So if you do want to go into some more detail around what specific languages and how we got there, that would be a really good one to check out with Dr. Corey Vilsant. She had a great presentation as well. So I do recommend that to everybody. And I think we have time for one more question here, but how do we track that this language is working?
I'll start. So the survey that I mentioned is the Shatterproof Addiction Stigma Index. A few years ago, Shatterproof surveyed the first iteration of the Shatterproof Addiction Stigma Index, or the SASI, S-A-S-I. And this was the largest study ever fielded on addiction stigma. And a version of that SASI is what we implement when I say that we surveyed the California population. So for us, as we continue to implement the Unshamed California campaign, we survey regularly to ensure that our messages are in fact contributing to addiction stigma reduction in the state of California. So we use person-first messaging in our communications in this campaign. So I would say that that is one way that we can track the success of this language. We also engage in message testing at Shatterproof to ensure that this message is resonating with members of our priority audiences or populations for these campaigns. We also have results in other states where we are supporting interventions, such as one in the state of Kentucky, where our 12-month survey reviewed a positive relationship between our campaign implementation and addiction stigma reduction. And we look forward to publishing those results at a later date.
Anything to add to that, Lauren?
I don't. She covered it.
Awesome. We are at time, so I just want to see if there are any last things that you guys would like to leave the audience with. If not, thank you everybody so much for attending today. I see there's still a couple of questions from David and Tom. I'll make note of those and see that our panelists get them as well. Otherwise, feel free to email me, Asha, or Lauren. We are here and ready to answer any questions you might have. Thank you everybody so much for your participation and attendance today. These were great questions.